It's a major election year, and we're going to talk about one of the long-standing challenges in U.S. democracy, racial and ethnic gaps in voter registration rates between white eligible voters and eligible voters of color. And there's a particular dissidence we're going to focus on. Asian Americans and Latinos are two of the fastest growing groups of eligible voters in the US, but their registration rates are among the lowest, according to the Census Bureau's current population survey. And if you're interested in having a healthy democracy with strong participation in elections from eligible voters, regardless of their race or ethnicity, this is not a good sign. So we're going to dig into why and what can be done to boost voter registration among eligible voters. Let me introduce you our panelists today. Today, you'll hear from Terry Minnis, the Vice President of the Census and Voting Programs for Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC, one of the country's leading advocacy groups focused on advancing the civil and human rights of Asian Americans. Terry has helped lead campaigns to reauthorize the Voting Rights Act in 2006 and has been appointed to the American Bar Association's Standing Committee on Elections. Terry, thank you for joining us. We also hear from
Thank you,
Rodrigo.
Hansi.
Thank you, Terry. We also hear from Rodrigo Dominguez Villegas, the Director of Research at the UCLA Latino Policy and Politics Institute and the Director of the Latino Data Hub. Rodrigo's research has focused on the characteristics of Latino voters, plus Latino representation in elected and appointed positions. Rodrigo, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Terry, let's start with you, if you don't mind. This racial and ethnic gap in voter registrations rates between white eligible voters and Asian American eligible voters and Latino eligible voters based on national estimates from the Census Bureau's current population survey. From the last two federal election years, we're talking about 2022 and 2020, you can see this disparity in registration rates between white and Asian eligible voters around 9 percentage points. And between white and Latino eligible voters, there's a gap of about 13 percentage points. But this is not a new trend. And it seems like there's a lot more focus on talking about the gaps in voter turnout than the voter registration gap. Why do you think that is, Terry?
So I think that you're absolutely right. I just wanted to reemphasize the point that you made that this is not a new phenomenon. This is something that certainly since data have been available for Asian American voting participation rates since about, since the 2000 election, we have seen a consistent about double-digit gap between both voter registration and voter turnout for Asian American persons as compared to white voters. And I know similar statistics exist, right, for the Latino population. And I think that you point to something that's important. And I would say that it's neither voter turnout or voter registration that should be lifted up as being more important. We need both, right? We do know, if you look at that data closely, that once our community members are registered, they're more likely to turn out. The turnout rate for those registered come closer to parity with white voters. And I believe a lot of that is because once you're able to register our community members and all the GOTV efforts that occur in the education and the engagement of people to get them willing to register, it is an easier jump from that to turning folks out. So to that point, I think it is very important that we are looking at the registration rates, because if we're able to register people at higher rates, then in theory, we should be able to see them turn out also in higher rates. That should help to close the disparities. So I think that you're correct that we should be looking at the voter registration numbers, and perhaps for some, why they focus more on turnout is because it is very outcome focused and looking at turnout as the only important metric. But as I just stated, that to me is not the only metric, and that registration rate is an important metric to keep an eye on, to work to address, because it can ultimately help also address the turnout issue as well.
I think what you just said really reminds me that voting is a two-step process in the United States. You got to register to vote, and then you're able to cast your ballot. You can't just say, oh, I'm eligible to vote, I'm just going to cast my ballot. You got to be part of that registration process, which can be complicated for a lot of folks. And Rodrigo, I remember when we last talked, when I did a story about this topic for NPR, that You said that the racial and ethnic gap in voter registration rate, this is not something that we should be talking about just because it's a presidential election year. This is something we should be talking about all the time, right?
Absolutely. Well, thank you for reporting on this and bringing it up to a national conversation. And we are talking about this in 2024, but as I have always bring up in forums, it's really important that we keep in mind this this important trend about registration gaps for different demographic groups throughout the whole time. Why? Because closing those registration gaps, will take a lot of efforts, and we're going to be discussing. Terry and I will be discussing a lot about the structural factors as to why these turnout or these registration gaps exist, and because the factors are so historic and structural, it is really important that we're always thinking about what kinds of things do we need to change so that more Latino, more Asian voters are able to register and participate in a healthy democracy.
And Rodrigo, I know you helped put out a report on this specific topic. And I remember the last time we talked, you also kind of broke this down, that you said there are historical, structural issues behind the reason why there's this voter registration gap, and also some other categories. How did you laid out 3 different buckets? What are those 3 buckets, would you say, of reasons why this voter registration gap by race ethnicity exists?
Yeah, all of them are systemic or structural. So I like to think about this as systemic or structural, but within those systemic gaps, I think of them as 3 buckets. One is demographics. The first fact is that both Latino and Asian voters as a demographic they're both much younger than the general electorate. And regardless of racial ethnic group, it has been much harder to engage younger voters than older voters in the process. That is just a fact in the United States. It is also a fact internationally. And so in general, younger people are harder to get involved in electoral processes, and that's one part of it. Another part of demographics is the fact that a higher percentage of Latino and Asian eligible voters are naturalized citizens. That means they were born abroad and they have become US citizens. And what does that mean? That demographically, we have a higher percentage of these 2 groups that are learning the ropes on how to get registered in the United States. Well, first of all, about these 2-tier systems, right? Where in like many countries where people come from, that 2-tier system that you explained, in first you register and then voting, does not necessarily match. But then there's other things in the US, for instance, different from many other countries. Elections are run almost at the county level, and if not at the state level. So rules to register, easiness of registering, not all the different ins and outs are not a federal thing. It's not like one rule. You've got to really do your research to understand that. And so if you're a naturalized citizen, there's a lot more, in addition to learning a lot about other things about a new country, right? So in addition to that, so those are like demographic. That's a demographic bucket. The other bucket that I think of is, I call it like the historic / systemic. I think that no one single voter mobilization program will be necessarily able to counter decades of centuries of neglect and hostility towards Latino and Asian voters, starting with the fact that registration in its origin was established with the intent to disenfranchise immigrant voters. And so we have an intent about why registration existed from the beginning, and dismantling that is really, really hard. The other thing about this is not just the historic hostility against voters, but the fact that data shows that political campaigns, even very recently, do not invest in registering and getting out the vote for Latino and Asian communities the same way as they do for others. And so Pew Research has a very important study that shows that in the 2020 election, for instance, Latino and Asian voters were a lot less likely to be engaged, reached out to by campaigns, either by mail, phone, etc., than white voters did. Last, within this bucket is the tactics to restrict voter registration. And so we've seen ever since 2013, but also historically, an increase in legislation for restrictive voter ID laws, voter purges, gerrymandering, all of which disproportionately affect Latino and Asian voters and discourage them from participating in the electoral process. And very quickly, the last one is the motivational bucket, which is what are the structural factors that would actually get people to get motivated and go out and register? And that has to do with seeing themselves represented in government and seeing their priorities being pushed forward by those who got elected before.
So if I remember correctly, you're saying the three buckets, Rodrigo. One, motivational issues. We also have structural, historical, systemic issues, and also the demographics of these eligible voter populations. Terry, do you agree? Does this kind of three buckets theory of the reasons why there's this voter registration gap, do you agree? Does this apply in your experience to the Asian American eligible voter population?
Yes, absolutely. I think that completely makes sense. One additional piece I would add to one of the demographic points that Rodrigo had made around where our populations are born and being naturalized, higher levels of naturalized citizens in our voter population also brings up the language barrier and the language issue, right? In addition to these being new systems that need to be learned, complex systems that need to be learned, and multiple different systems depending on where you live. Even as Rodrigo had pointed out, even if you're in the same state and you just happen to move to a different county, could be different enough, right, where that process is confusing to begin with. So if you think about the fact that somebody is coming in and they are new to the system, new to the idea of the two-tier system, and so forth, and for whom English is their second language, it complicates, right, the process and makes the voting process that more difficult. We also know that voting materials are written at a much higher level, right? I think one study that was done assessed it at about a high school or collegiate level of English. Sometimes, particularly with our ballot initiatives, things are written in a way to be confusing because they're trying to elicit a certain response. Things are not written in plain English and can be confusing for native English speakers, right? So you can only imagine for folks for whom English is a second language, it becomes that much more confusing. And then finally, also, I think going a little bit to the structural voters, particularly voters who appear to be immigrant or who are assumed to be immigrant, can face additional challenges, right? I know that's one thing that we consistently talk about for the Asian American voter, that they are stigmatized by a perpetual foreigner stereotype, right? So an assumption that automatically you must be, not an American, right? And therefore deserve extra scrutiny or are deserving of suspicion in the voting process. If you have an accent, that becomes even worse. We have seen this in instances that have happened over and over across the country, right? In different states and in different localities. And what ends up happening is if a voter, a limited English proficient voter, goes to the polls and has a bad interaction, perhaps there is a poll worker who is treating them a little bit like suspiciously or with distrust, that can be a bad experience. Or if they're having a little more difficulty, because it's a new system, because it's a new process, because they're dealing with language barriers and they take a little bit longer, people may start getting frustrated with them or creating a bad experience. And the problem is, we know that if a new voter goes to vote and has a bad experience, they are not going to come back to vote. So you've done the work to register them. You've even gotten them out to vote, but then they have this terrible experience because of no fault of their own. They are trying to be a part of our democratic process. They're not going to come back, and so all that good work will have gone down the drain. So I think that absolutely agree with the with how Rodrigo had framed the buckets and the concerns for the barriers to voting for Latino and Asian Americans.
And the language challenges you were talking about, Terry, I wonder that there is a federal law that I know you helped work on, the Voting Rights Act, that has requirements for certain communities, depending on certain levels of literacy as well as language needs, that voting materials, including voter registration forms, have to be translated into certain languages, right?
That's correct. Section 203 of the Voting Rights Act does require certain jurisdictions that meet a threshold out that is laid out in the federal statute, requires those jurisdictions to provide both written translated materials, multilingual assistance at the polls, as well as publicity of the availability of this assistance, which is great when it's properly implemented. So that's one problem. Not everybody implements it to full compliance. Sometimes it's a malicious intent, and sometimes it's just, people are trying to do their best, but perhaps they weren't able to recruit enough bilingual poll workers. Perhaps they didn't put them in the right place. Perhaps they sent the translated ballots to the polling site, but the people working at the polling site failed to actually take it out of the shrink wrap and put it out for people to use. So there are implementation, issues that still occur. Additionally, rightfully so, there is a threshold that needs to be met, but that also means there are a lot of limited English proficient voters across the country who need assistance, who don't have that afforded to them. Another limitation to Section 203 is that it is limited to specific language groups that were found by Congress to experience voting discrimination and discrimination for other issues that affected their ability to participate back in 1975 when Section 203 was first enacted. Those groups are Spanish speakers, Asian Americans, Alaskan Natives, and American Indians. So that is a very important, sizable population, but we also know that the language minority population extends significantly beyond that. Luckily, there are other provisions of the Voting Rights Act that can help. Section 2, the national anti-discrimination provision of the Voting Rights Act, if you will, can be used and has been used on behalf of language minority voters when they face discrimination because of their national origin or their language abilities. We also have Section 208 of the Voting Rights Act, which allows for people to bring assistance of their choice to the polls with them, right, for reasons of either a disability reason or the inability to read or write English. You can bring somebody into the polls, actually into the booth with you to help assist you, which is great. There are no limitations. That's nationwide. Same thing with Section 2, that's nationwide. There are no limitations with respect to language groups or application. The only restriction on Section 208 is the person helping you can't be your employer and it can't be your union rep. Otherwise, you can bring your children with you. You can bring somebody, perhaps who, isn't, your relatives, anybody you can bring in with you to assist. Other issues, though, with that is that oftentimes people are unaware, poll workers are unaware of this right. And so people can be denied their ability to bring in somebody of their choice for that. But there are protections, to get around to your initial question. There are protections under federal law that protect language minority voters. And we know that states also include some protections, and a good thing that we've been seeing, particularly with places that are looking to enact their own state Voting Rights Act, that there is more and more language assistance being provided in more and more localities, both from the state, the local level to state level to the federal level.
It sounds like the bottom line is it really depends on where you live, where you're an eligible voter, the level of assistance that you may be able to access. Voting is really a really local activity in a lot of ways and designed to be. Rodrigo, I want to go back to you were talking about earlier that there are a particular set of challenges that eligible voters who are naturalized U.S. citizens have to face if they're interested in getting registered to vote, participating in elections. And I wonder, some people may think, well, at naturalization ceremonies, often there are voter registration drives and a lot of different DMV offices around the country. When you're getting a photo ID, a driver's license, you can very easily register to vote. Why are those opportunities at naturalization ceremonies, at the DMV, why is that not enough to help folks overcome that voter registration, make sure that they get registered?
Yeah, thanks, Hansi. This is a very important question, and to me, it has to do with trust. And I think of trust almost as an institution, or the lack of trust. Rightfully so. Many people in our communities, and I'm going to talk particularly about Latino communities, have a lot of distrust in interacting with government agencies, even when they're becoming naturalized, right? What happens at naturalization ceremonies? It's a celebration of becoming American. Naturalization ceremonies are an incredible act where people come there very hopeful. However, many of the people who are in naturalization ceremonies are members of what we call mixed status families, where some other people in their families have not been able to get the proper documentation to live in the United States. They themselves might have had history of having been persecuted, criminalized, discriminated against, many other types of just aggressions towards them by public offices, public authorities, the government. And so I think rightfully so, many people just are distrustful of other government agencies and what happens once you interact, even when they're becoming citizens. I don't think that lack of trust goes away just because of becoming a citizen. And that is something that we see over and over in our communities, that they either don't go immediately to register at the naturalization ceremony because of that. They don't want to do that. And then about licenses and other restrictions, it's a little bit of a similar situation, particularly in some states. Although there is a great move by many states to provide, first of all, the ability for anybody, regardless of citizenship, to get a driver's license, and that has expanded. Services have improved in many states. It's not the same everywhere. So there are some states and where still, when people go and talking about what Terry was saying, right? Like getting a driver's license, the going to the DMV office, your experience will vary significantly where depending on where you are and who is that person that you're interacting with. And historically, unfortunately, that interaction has been hostile, despite positive changes in many places. So I think addressing that lack of trust first has to start with rhetoric about our communities nationally, and our communities being recognized for who they are and what they are positively, and then that translating into actual government services and institutions respecting the humanity of our community, so that lack of trust can be turned around.
It sounds like you're both describing issues that are really, in a lot of ways, very deeply ingrained challenges that it doesn't sound like there are a lot of overnight fixes, that there has to be a sustained effort to address all these different issues you've laid out. And I wonder, I was following some nonprofit groups in Pennsylvania that were trying to encourage more eligible voters, Asian American eligible voters, Latino Asian eligible voters to get registered to vote. And I saw them, on the ground, visiting senior centers, just on the sidewalk outside of supermarkets, trying to encourage people with tablets with the voter registration form ready to go and say, hey, fill this out. You should register to vote. And you could see how hard it was to have that one-on-one conversation to try to convince someone who is eligible to vote, but for whatever reason isn't registered yet and has to take that step. And I wonder, from both of your experiences, is there a type of effort or a type of message that often seems to be more effective in trying to address those mistrust issues or lack of trust issues or motivational issues, or just, just not being aware of the process?
Sure. So happy to start. I think one of the motivating messages that work here are ones that worked for the census, as you remember, Hansi, and that is that this activity helps your community, helps your family, right? And really trying to draw those connections of how, how your vote could impact what school your kid goes to, whether a stop sign is put in front of your house in the neighborhood because of, traffic patterns, things like that, helping to make those connections. And that's why you need that one-on-one, right? That's why you need to have that dedicated time to help talk through these things, because it is easy for people to sort of see it as like, oh, my vote just goes off into a black hole and it is what it is. And something kicks back out to me and I don't understand that connection. And I think back to something that Rodrigo said at the very beginning around this needing to be an all the time thing, right? It shouldn't be something that just happens around presidential elections. The reality is there are a lot of elections that occur, and there are a lot of elections that really impact a person's day to day, right? And so helping people understand, like school board elections, city council elections, county executives, things like that, helping people understand how that all plays, and in some ways helping to understand how governance and government works, particularly for naturalized citizens who likely come from different systems, and understanding that is a good or a necessary, not just it is good, but it's also a necessary step, I think, to being able to get people to get over that hump of engaging. And as you mentioned, I think some other really key points are the fact that you said, who are the messengers? It's people from the community talking to the community, right? And to the extent that there might be some cultural awareness or understanding that occurs, the language ability that might be able to help bridge some of the barriers around that, and meeting people where they are, which you were talking about. You're not just sitting in one place and saying, you need to come to me and I will do this for you. It's going to people at grocery stores and like, okay, I'm meeting you. Hey, the grocery store prices, they're going up. Did you know that how you vote could impact this? And helping to draw those connections, I think, are some of the really key points. But as Rico said, this needs to happen all the time. If you come in, you parachute in, and say like, hey, do you know this is going to happen? You parachute out and they don't actually see it happen. People aren't going to believe in that. That distrust is only going to widen. And so we really need to be there and doing the work and really building up infrastructure and capacity within communities and showing people how they all connect to make this a better society for all.
Rodrigo, from your experience, is there a strategy, a message that seems to be more effective than others in terms of trying to boost registration rates?
I can say it better than Terry. I think Terry covered every single point. The local elections, and we talk a lot about the problems in the system, etc. There are some amazing. I'm not from the U.S. There are some amazing things about electoral processes and democracy in the United States. Some of which I have no idea about, and many people don't have an idea about. And Terry mentioned many of them, right? I wasn't used to electing my school board, and many people aren't. But who is in the school board will decide your children's education and their day-to-day experience at school. And so I think messages that resonate at that level, like you have kids who are going to these schools, electing who is going to be making the policy decisions for your kids is a first step. That like very clear how do elections impact you is, I think, well, and data has shown that it just works really, really well. In terms of other specific, well, the other thing is the sustainability about this. It has to, and then, yeah, I think other than that, exactly what I agree with every single other point that Terry mentioned.
Oh, Rodrigo, it's really interesting what you said about your just you were really taken that you had the opportunity to vote for your local school board members, whereas some people, sometimes we hear about, oh, these down ballot races they're called, and all these different names, all these different candidates that people may not be familiar with because maybe there's less media coverage because they're very local races. But you're saying, we take a look at it from a different angle. These are the positions that may affect people's daily lives in a much more direct way. Your children's education, for example, and that could be a motivating factor to get someone registered to vote. I also want to, we've been talking a lot about kind of more at the individual level, and I know we've also been talking about more at the systemic level. I want to get back to that because as you both laid out, this is not a simple issue. This is a very complicated issue, and there's certainly systemic issues at play here. And I wonder, there's been talk about how automatic voter registration efforts could really change the game in terms of getting folks who are not registered, who are eligible to vote, get them registered in a much easier way, much more systemic way, a systematic way to make it a much just smoother process for folks to be able to participate in elections. And I wonder, are there other systemic changes that you see that could really change the game here and really address this voter registration gap?
So happy to start. So on automatic voter registration, which I know isn't your immediate question, but I do feel compelled to have to say this. I think we have to be cautious about how automatic voter registration is brought to life, so to speak, right? I think clearly the general concept of putting the onus on the government rather than the individual to register people, I think certainly is a laudable goal. One thing to note though, if you remember, I had discussed earlier that we see that there is a nexus between, certainly for Asian Americans and I believe for Latinos as well, that once registered, you start to see more parity with respect to the turnout rates. But as I said, I think that is because you have all of this effort and engagement and education to get people to register. If you automatically register people, people may not realize that you lose all of that education. That doesn't mean you can't get to it in other ways, but it's important to recognize that it wasn't just the fact that they were registered, it's how they got registered, what happened, and that led them to registering that would then lead them to churn out. So certainly, and it is complicated. It's not just, for example, if if you have legislation that's going to create automatic voter registration, making sure that there is funding in there for voter engagement and education, and that it's done in different languages as well to make sure that you're hitting all the right people. But also for all the groups that are doing GOTV work now, is their funding going to dry up because now there's not their registration? So there are a lot of intricacies about that. The other big fundamental thing about automatic voter registration is what is being done to protect people who accidentally, inadvertently get added to the rolls automatically who are not eligible. Because certainly for one of the groups or subgroups of that, of which there are many Asian Americans and Latinos, non-citizens who are ineligible to vote or ineligible to register, who get accidentally registered, they can suffer severe consequences. They can become deportable. They could become ineligible for naturalization for life. These are not small consequences. And there is that tension, right? Unless you have a federal bill that creates automatic voter registration that has the proper protective language in it, we are potentially opening up, right, concerns and problems for our community members completely inadvertently. But these are serious consequences. It's not a small fine or even a large fine that you can just somehow pay off and keep on going. These can have lasting life-altering consequences. So that was just my piece on AVR, which doesn't mean we shouldn't continue to try to create a system that does work for everybody, just to know that there are some landmines that we need to make sure that we are watching out for and addressing. One other really huge, I think, opportunity on the reform side is same-day registration. You get rid of that two-tier system insofar as that timing gap. That will help significantly, right? For people who are not familiar with these processes or with how our voting occurs in this country, they can then go on election day, because they're aware of it, they finally realize it, and they can actually go register that day and vote. So that would be, I guess, my number one choice for a reform that could help with the registration.
Same day registration, Terry. That's what you're saying. That's your
Correct.
preference.
Yes.
Rodrigo, is there a systemic solution that we haven't talked about or you think deserves more attention?
I agree with Terry so much about the importance of the automatic voter registration being done very carefully and thoughtfully. In terms of same-day registration, that could be an important tool. Currently, only 22 states and the District of Columbia have same-day registration. So there's a lot that can be changed there. And then the other is online voter registration versus in-person or by mail. And for that, 42 states have online voter registration. And online voter registration can address a little bit of the things that Terry brought up before. And that, I also talked about. It's this distrust of facing, or possibly the discomfort, embarrassment, etc., of being one-on-one with a person or having to mail something and instead doing it online. Of course, we can have a whole other conversation about lack of access to connectivity and internet, etc. However, online voter registration can, for many voters, could be a way to overcome the first step. And also language-wise, right? It is so much easier to translate one website, one page, the content there, into multiple languages and allow people to see their language represented there in that those registration forms, etc., than to have to print out all the materials and to distribute all the materials to the places where there are people who don't speak languages, or who don't speak English and who speak a language other than English. And so I think it is, we've got to utilize all the tools to little by little start overcoming these structural factors.
And it sounds like both of you are pointing out there really is no one-size-fits-all solution, that if we want fuller participation in U.S. democracy, really need to think about all the different needs and circumstances that different eligible voters, where they're coming from, what they need in order to participate fully. And I wonder if, just kind of a forward-looking question then, is if we get to a place where these voter registration gaps are reduced or eliminated even, how do you think U.S. democracy could change if these voter registration gaps that have long persisted, if they were to go away? What would U.S. democracy look like, in your opinion?
I think it would represent a lot more of what the fundamental idea of a representative democracy and electoral democracy is all about, which is this idea of one person, one vote. On election day or election season, it is the one moment where ideally, right, we haven't got there. Everybody, regardless of income, race, etc., should be the same, because everybody has their one vote to make a decision to elect their their government. I think a lot of it comes back to remembering the fundamental. And right now, we're not realizing that fundamental value, golden standard of electoral democracy. Because for many people, they don't have access to that very powerful tool.
Yeah, I think if we got to that point, we would see, as Rodrigo said, a more representative, right, electorate, and presumably a more representative government, because it will be based off of those who are voting for them. I think that it is also important to remember that that's one piece of the puzzle. We still have other aspects of our democracy that will affect how that completely plays out, such as redistricting, such as how, other what's what I'm thinking, other policies may be put in place, such as some voter suppression bills that could perhaps, if registration were reached and parity were reached on that, if things followed along with what data are showing now, we should also reach parity, right, with respect to turnout. But we also know that people are very creative. And if gains are being made on one front, sorry to be the Debbie Downer, but if gains are being made on that front, it is not unlikely for us to see efforts to tamp down and affect perhaps like the turnout piece of it in a way that we just currently don't see. But I think in with my happy hat on, I will say we'll have a much more representative, society, and one that will hopefully be more engaged writ large, right? Will feel more a part of the community. So, voting is a very important piece of civic engagement and civic participation, but it's not the only, right? One could feel that, one could hypothesize that if, we had parity with respect to voter registration, that people might also be as engaged in wanting to contact their elected officials, wanting to, volunteer at polling locations. And if all of these happen, then everything within our civic engagement becomes more reflective of our community, and therefore should be more responsive to the diversity of our community.
Well, if you don't mind me, then I'll ask a really fraught question, because there often is there is a delay in finding out what voter registration rates will look like in 2024 by race ethnicity. The Census Bureau doesn't release those results out immediately, so we won't find out for a while. And I wonder, do both of you have any predictions? Do you think things are going to stay the same, be better, be worse in terms of this voter registration gap by race ethnicity?
Rodrigo may be better suited to do those predictions, because I know you look at these numbers more. But the one thing I would just say is I don't suspect there to be big, wild changes. I would expect everything to be sort of at the margins, either which way it goes. But I will turn it over to the expert on these thoughts.
No, I agree with you, Terry. I think we're likely not going to see anything that is outstanding this election cycle. However, there are some encouraging signs and some discouraging. Encouragement is community members, community-based organizations in both the Asian American and Latino communities around the country have started building up something that Terry mentioned before, which is the infrastructure to go and do voter outreach, voter registration. And this year, at least amongst the Latino community, we see that there is investment that has been growing and sustained since the past election, particularly in certain states, and that can help. And of course, it's like always the energy of our communities that are always pushing this. So I think that's an encouraging thing that might push registration a little bit further. There are a couple of states that have made positive moves legislation-wise in trying to address some of the structural factors. There are some discouraging signs also in some other states moving ahead with passing some legislation that might discourage voters, particularly voters of color, to register. And then there is one other element, I think, where kind of like canvassers and people who are knocking on doors and calling and going to the grocery store and going to a soccer game to try to register people up are fighting against, which is that the past two election cycles have been sold as or have just had such immense consequences to in people's imagination, but also like actual direct consequences in people. And so they have been sold, the last two elections were sold as kind of like, this is the election of your life, and this is what's gonna either improve or completely destroy your life in the United States. And what that means, and then on the ground, a lot of people don't see changes, don't see improvements in the day-to-day, don't see improvements in how immigrants are being treated in the United States. They might not be seeing improvements in the ways in which rhetorics are being handled by different elected officials. And so I think, unfortunately, our canvassers in our community, they have to be fighting against that reality, and against a little bit of like voter fatigue, maybe, in that it's become so polarized. Society has become so polarized, and the messaging around participating and the death of democracy, including like actual threats to our democratic system, that I think are very energetic, mostly young activists who are trying to engage our communities and trying to reduce this registration gap, are having to overcome those bigger factors that have to do with politics and other things.
And Terry, if I can come back to you, why are you less optimistic that things would change in terms of this voter registration gap?
I think for the similar reasons, right, as Rodrigo has pointed out. I think that we know from the post-election survey that we ran after the midterm election that, the things that people found as sort of reasons why they decided not to vote, like included things like concerns about long lines, concerns about COVID, and unable to get enough info on candidates and a conflicting schedule. And at the same time, the motivations are getting accurate, credible information about issues and candidates, having better candidates to choose from, as well as being able to get time off, right, from school, work, caregiver duties to be able to go vote. All of those things, I think we haven't seen significant changes as to how people approach these things, right? Getting information about candidates, issues, what are the focus of ads? What are the focus? Are people pushing, the local elections, or is everything focused, or is all the funding going right towards the big ticket items, so to speak? I just don't see enough changes in how we're approaching these elections to think that we're going to see significant changes. That doesn't mean I don't anticipate possibly things going up slightly or going down slightly. And I think Rodrigo's right. A lot of it's going to depend on states. It's going to depend on what are the state laws and what are the investments going into states, who's getting contacted, who's not. That I feel in the aggregate, at the end of the day, we're just not going to see major movement one way or the other for this election. I'm happy to be proven wrong if it goes up significantly. I'd be very happy to be proven wrong. But I just don't see enough levers of change for that to be a likely outcome that I would feel comfortable predicting.
Well, like Rodrigo says, we should keep on talking about this topic. It seems like it will continue to be relevant. And so we can check in later to see how things turn out after this year's general elections in 2024. And in the meantime, I want to thank you both for sharing your expertise with us. Terry Minnis with the Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC, and Rodrigo Dominguez Villegas of the UCLA Latino Policy and Politics Institute. Thank you both.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.